Where I left off with Christopher Rufo was talking about the rise of critical race theory and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Christopher Rufo took a lot of America by surprise. And I wrote in the Washington Post that, as you recount, the murder of George Floyd and the events preceding to that, Michael Brown, Jacob Blake, many other incidents, gave rise to this ferment. And then the murder of George Floyd was right in front of everyone. But you recount in the book, Black Lives Matter is based on a faulty premise that police violence resulting in death against unarmed black males is quite widespread. It's not. You bring the stats as told by my newspaper, the Washington Post. What are the statistics? And then let's work into the ideology that are based on false statistics.
Yeah, I mean, the statistics, in some ways, obviously, any instance of especially an unjust police killing is a tragedy and should be handled by law enforcement. But most of the people who are killed by police are armed, dangerous, and in active confrontation with police officers. And if you look at the unarmed black men, which is the kind of key demographic for the Black Lives Matter narrative, you're looking at maybe slightly more than a dozen cases. But just because you're unarmed doesn't
In
mean
a
that you're not
year,
a threat in a
in
year
one
or
year.
a
Yeah.
potentially a lethal threat. And so the numbers are not commensurate with the rhetoric, and the numbers, even such, again, because you're unarmed doesn't mean that you're not dangerous or potentially lethally dangerous. And so the number of unjustified shootings is even smaller than that in a large country with millions of police encounters per year. But the BLM movement, much like the Black Panther Party movement that was preceded it by half century, they both knew that this is the key rhetorical mechanism to gain power. And I found in my research the Black Panther Party memoirs, interviews, and other materials from the time period, from the 60s and 70s. They said very explicitly, we attempt to bait police officers in confrontation. They were running ambushes against police officers. They wanted to monitor and harass and intimidate police officers and stoke confrontation because they believed that the violent confrontation with the police was their best recruiting tool. They said that very explicitly, and their best promotional tool. And so the narrative around uh, you know police brutality, the narrative around confrontation with the police, the narrative around so-called disproportionate criminal justice sentencing and prison numbers has been part of that rhetorical toolkit since the very beginning. And while it may have felt new to many people in 2015 to 2020, it may have felt like fresh ideas, fresh language, fresh concepts. Everything down to the actual vocabulary was already fully developed by 1968. And in a sense, the radicals of BLM innovated, only in the means of communication using social media, etc. But Angela Davis and her colleagues had developed all of the concepts and all of the words that they used, all the slogans even that they used many, many decades before.
The incident is not mentioned in America's Cultural Revolution, but I first became aware of the ideological and violent inclination of Black Panthers when Alan Keyes was the tutor in Winthrop House in 1974 to 1978. Alan had to flee Cornell University with Alan Bloom because the Black Panthers took over Cornell University and they threatened to kill any black on campus who was not of them. There was, and this has remained kind of a theme of every argument. You're with us or you're against us. And by with us, you're marching or you're not marching. You're with the police or you're with BLM. And that's given rise to a spiral down in race relations in America that I did not think possible. When Barack Obama was elected, I wrote a column saying, look, I'm not very happy with his politics, but the best thing is it's the fulfillment of the promise of Lincoln. It didn't turn out that way at all, Christopher Rufo. Was he captured? Was his administration captured by CRT and the intellectuals that Angela Davis and Derek Bell birthed? And I'm going to come back to their opposition through those 40 years. But what happened? That was supposed to be the moment when America's racial reckoning had ended and we were to equality in fact as well as theory.
Yeah, it's really one of the kind of tragedies and a very disillusioning moment. Of course, I think everyone, Barack Obama had this soaring rhetoric. I don't think that Barack Obama was driven by this kind of radical politics. Yes, he had
I
early
agree.
connections with Bill Ayers. Yes, he had early connections with Derek Bell. But the way that he governed, the way that he had public rhetoric, it was, of course, on the left. It was, of course, on the left on healthcare and other issues. But I don't think that he was driven by CRT. But for a number of reasons, if you look at the public polling data from Pew, from Gallup, and others, there is what I call a racial retrograde that sits in around 2015 and accelerates into 2020. The public perception that race relations were good, that opportunity was available, that things were getting better on racial issues, reaches a kind of high point in American life and then just collapses towards the end of Barack Obama's second term, and then further collapses, of course, throughout Trump's first term. And so this is, in my view, the great tragedy. I think so many people on left and right had a moment of hope, felt like we could maybe get beyond some of those entrenched conflicts, turned out not to be true. And I think it's in part because the left itself became extremely disillusioned with President Obama. Really, no one on the radical left, including Barack Obama's old mentor, Derek Bell, who was the godfather of CRT, towards the end of his life, in I think 2010, he gave a speech as an elderly man, and he said, Barack Obama, my former mentee at Harvard Law School, is in a sense a black president of a white supremacist country. And so actually, it wasn't a symbol of progress. It was a symbol of bitterness, that he was a symbol that presided over a fundamentally rotten country. And that's the narrative that really prevailed.
I want people to know that Christopher Rufo is relentlessly honest in this record. So, for example, Derek Bell, Harvard Law School's first black professor, is opposed among black intellectuals by liberals like H. Lewis Gates and Randall Kennedy and conservatives like Thomas Sowell and Justice Thomas. But Derek Bell is a story unto himself. It's an epic story. It's a tragedy, actually, what Derek Bell does. Because he's a man of great physical courage, some intellectual accomplishment. He was not a scholar, and I'm not a scholar. I'm a good teacher. I don't know if Derek Bell was a good teacher. I teach con law, but I don't spend my days in the stacks. I don't do books like this. This is a work of scholarship. How do you explain Derek Bell's movement? Because we're moving here from Marcuse to Angela Davis. Next is Derek Bell. We'll come back to Paulo Freire. But who is Derek Bell? Why does he matter so much, Christopher?
Yeah, Derek Bell is a pivotal figure, and he is the godfather of critical race theory. The discipline of CRT was established by his students and by his mentees and the circle around him at Harvard Law School. And he's famous because he became the first black full-time law professor at Harvard. And but his story begins with the point of optimism and then goes through this period of disillusionment. He becomes a civil rights lawyer after serving in the Air Force, after gaining a position at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He actually goes down to the Deep South and files these desegregation cases on behalf of black residents in these really poor cities and towns around the South. He has immense courage, as you said, physical courage even. He oversees 300 desegregation cases against significant opposition, against threats to his safety, against a lot of pressure down south, and he really, in a kind of noble way, helps so many of these families gain better access to education. But then he goes through this period where he actually turns against the desegregation movement, against Brown versus Board. He says that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish. And he develops this theory of racial pessimism, where that he developed over time at Harvard Law, in which he describes every instance of what he views as supposed racial progress as a smokescreen, as an illusion, as a mechanism of manipulation and control. And so he gets to the point where he says that Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 14th Amendment were really to serve corporate interests, not to liberate blacks from slavery and oppression. He says that in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was merely a way for the white power structure to make its racial domination more subtle, more complex, more insidious. And then, of course, as I mentioned, he says that even the election of Barack Obama was a way to put a symbol of African American, the African American community that actually served to entrench again those kind of white interests or white power structure. And so, in every turn, he becomes the idealist in his youth that goes to a cynic in his middle age, and towards the end, he's a nihilist. I mean, he really sees no hope of progress. He says that we're on the verge of what he calls a black genocide in the United States. And he says in one of his famous stories or parables that white Americans would actually sell or trade the entire black population of the United States to aliens from outer space in order to banish them from Earth. I mean, his view becomes so dark, so cynical, so pessimistic. And then paradoxically, at the same time, he becomes even more famous, more well recognized, more influential, and more powerful. And so it's this really sad confluence of incentives that led him to this point of no return in his thinking. And then, of course, in my view, paradoxically, but certainly in an ironic way, his pessimism yields this great influence and is essential for the founding of critical race theory.
I don't know if you made this point explicitly. He's very much a Moses figure for the crits. And I say that he got to almost to the promised land. He saw it, but he did not enter in. When I went to law school in 1980 to 83, there were no crits, none, at the University of Michigan Law School, one of the top 5 law schools in the country. I don't believe there were any at Stanford or Yale. The crits were at Harvard. And you didn't, when I entered into the business of being part of the appointments committee at Chapman Law School in the early years when I chaired it, I didn't want anything to do with the crits because they had a capacity to destroy faculty relationship because they were so aggressive. The crits now run the academy, the legal academy. And so Derek Bell didn't see it coming because he saw people like Randall Kennedy not going with him. But at the same time, like a second meteor heading towards the intellectual University of America, Paulo Freire, I hope I'm saying his name right, is rocketing towards our education establishment, even as Derek Bell is heading into, in influence and students, our legal establishment. Let's pause and go off the Derek Bell path for a moment to talk about Paulo. Tell me how to say his name. I honestly didn't know a thing about him until I read your book.
Yeah, it's Paulo Freire, and he's a very interesting figure because he's almost totally unknown, but he is a kind of hidden master or hidden influence behind all of our education policy. And so Paulo Freire was born in Recife, Brazil. He became a kind of Marxist in Brazil. He became a kind of revolutionary pedagogist, meaning a theoretician of education. He was banished from Brazil after a military coup. He traveled around the third world, trying to work with communist movements to establish their education programs. He was actually a visiting scholar for a short stretch at Harvard, of course, overlapping very slightly with Derek Bell in the late 1960s. And then Paulo Freire, by kind of against all odds or all expectation, becomes the most influential person in educational theory in the United States. He's actually the third most cited author in all of the social sciences in the United States. He has the most assigned text for graduate schools of education that train our K12 teachers. And so he's had a profound influence. And the real irony, though, with Paulo Freire, something that I was shocked by once I dug into the details and really into the archival research, is that Paulo Freire served as a pedagogist and really a propagandist for Marxist-Leninist revolutionary governments in the Third World. And in particular, he was given kind of full reign over designing the educational program in a small country called Guinea-Bissau on Africa's west coast as their Marxist-Leninist kind of educational guru. And, he had these great theories that are now influential in American K-12 schools, but when he actually had the chance to put them into practice in this country, Guinea-Bissau, the researchers who looked into the archives in Guinea-Bissau at the actual statistical outcomes discovered that he didn't teach anyone how to read. His great educational theory that was put in power had no capacity to teach people even basic literacy. And so this kind of terrible, terrible irony is that what Paulo Freire failed to do in the third world, which was teach literacy, American teachers and graduate school professors are now trying to embed in the United States. And so, one thing that I saw over and over in all of the stories that I tell in the book is that these folks start with this great idealism. They implement their ideas, and they invariably yield disaster. I mean, over and over and over, they simply don't work. And in my view, if you're a educational theorist and your theories are not able to teach people even how to read at a basic, rudimentary level, it's time to try something different. And unfortunately, in the United States, we're really hurtling straight forward into this Paulo Freire's world.
Well, I am a bit of an optimist after reading America's Cultural Revolution about turning the tide, and we'll come back to that. But I want to borrow an actual historical example from the tragedy of the Native American experience in America, the Trail of Tears. As I follow Paulo Freire's career, it's not just Guinea-Bissau. I mean, he goes on to ruin education throughout the third world. Was it Mozambique and other places? He's just a failure wherever he goes because, Christopher, what I don't understand, we all know it doesn't work. Marxism, no matter what you call it, no matter how you dress it up, it never worked. It just yields tragedy, pain, and sorrow. And he is the walking, talking emblem of that because you follow his career. You're very fair-minded. He went from here to here. And by the way, you point out, he was in danger of his life in Brazil. They wanted to kill him. They threw him in jail for a while. Again, there's trauma at the bottom of every leftist, I've begun to believe. There's just deep disassociation from love. They have no love, no hope in the human soul, and they try and engineer love in through this crazy theory. But he's worse than Che. I mean, at least Castro got Cuba under his control and ran it as a police state. Lenin got the Soviet Union, Mao got China. These two get nothing. Che and Paulo, they're like the world's worst revolutionaries.
I know, and it is so fascinating because, in a sense, countries of the third world should be looking to the developed nations and the nations with very high literacy rates and figuring out, what those nations are doing and then replicating or copying or learning from those theories. But in fact, the opposite process has occurred, that the advanced, high literacy, industrialized Western nations are looking to the third world Marxist backwater regimes and then taking their educational theories and then implanting them in the United States. But Paulo Freire had a very interesting concept that I think is worth exploring, and I think there's actually some value to it. He talks about the third world in the first world. And what he means by this is that he looks at the American underclass, the American inner city, the American ghetto populations, and he describes them as kind of small third world enclaves within the larger first world context of the United States. And although I think his prescriptions are wrong, in some sense, he's documenting a very real process, a very real relationship, and something which neither liberals nor conservatives have really satisfactorily answered. This question of what is that relationship? How can one improve conditions? And until conservatives are able to do that and demonstrate results and demonstrate a better path, I'm afraid that demagogues like Paulo Freire will have a deep appeal to people. And although he may be offering bad ideas, in a sense, there is a vacuum. There is no alternative that the right has produced that has anything like the magnetic power of Paulo Freire.
When we come towards the end of this to talk about solutions, and we talk about the Hillsdale College charter schools and about various things like that, we'll discuss that. But I want to pause for a moment on Chaz, because this is not a remote threat for people. We have a couple of, you detail not only Chaz, but the Portland, just the nightmares that have occurred on the West Coast where theories of revolutionary CRT and DEI have taken root and been tried out. Let's start with Chaz. What's that stand for? Again, the neighborhood, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. What happened there, and remind people about what happened at Chaz.
Yeah, Chaz is quite interesting. And, I live in the Seattle area, and so I actually reported on the ground at Chaz for City Journal. And this moment during the George Floyd summer where activists and anti-police activists and Black Lives Matter protesters surrounded and Seattle's Capitol Hill police station. The police defended the police station with barricades. They went through multiple nights of this conflict, bottles, rocks, brass knuckles, tear gas. I mean, it was really hand-to-hand kind of trench combat. And then the mayor of Seattle at the time, Jenny Durkin, made the decision to abandon the East Precinct Police Department and essentially give it over to the rioters. And what happened next was quite interesting. It's actually reminiscent of the Paris Commune. But what happened is that these BLM activists took over not just the East Precinct Police Department, but they actually took over this huge section of the Capitol Hill neighborhood. They established barricades. They established an autonomous zone. The police stood down. They were not policing this area. And they declared essentially an independent republic inside the city of Seattle. They said it was going to be horizontal, governed without hierarchy in these great general assemblies where the community would set the standards. Of course, just like the Paris Commune before it, just like many of these utopian experiments, it ended in kind of tyranny. You had the very strong warlord, a guy named Raz Simone, who was pictured unloading AR-15s from the back of a white Tesla, passing them out to his group of kind of mercenary thugs, and then beating up anyone who would resist his rule. They had the homeless community put tents up all around the Chaz, and so it was quickly taken over by vagrants. Their trash was piling up, and then it all ended because it started to become a kind of murder zone. Multiple individuals, including a minor, were murdered in the Chaz. Police were unable to respond because they couldn't gain access to the zone. And then for a time, it actually had a homicide rate that was 50 times greater than that of Chicago. So it was actually the most deadly neighborhood in the United States during its short-lived rule. And
it
so
would be amusing were it not tragic.
Symbol.
You detail, there's a little hippie element, right? They wanted Woodstock at Chaz. They thought they were going to sell beads and tie-dye shirts, and they got wiped out. They just got rolled over by the guys with guns.
They wanted Woodstock, and they ended up with Baghdad. I mean, it's quite a stunning reversal. And I think it's a perfect symbol, though, is that the authority abdicated responsibility. The radicals established their utopian community based on their own view of human nature, their own view of ideal politics. And then within 3 weeks, it collapses and ends in disaster, ends in bloodshed. And of course, this was all done in the names of Black Lives Matter. But among those who were actually killed in the autonomous zone were some young Black men. And so it really, I thought, was the perfect symbol for 2020. And just like many Americans have forgotten about what happened with Angela Davis in the Marin Courthouse seizure, I think many Americans have already, just a few years later, forgotten about the details of that Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. I wanted to go back into it, rely on my reporting, show the kind of up close and personal look at what happened, so that we're not, we said that we don't fall victim to this great amnesia that seems to happen, where the left tries one of its ideas.
There's a beautiful bit of art. And this book is very well constructed, Christopher. My hat is off to you for America's Cultural Revolution, because side by side with Chaz, we have the descent of Portland and Antifa into chaos, and that's in the urban center where there's already crime and difficulty to go, side by side with Tigard and the school district of the upper middle class Anglo people. And they're both subject to revolution. One is violent, and one is ideologically determinative and totalitarian, but doesn't use violence. Can you explain both how the city of Portland inner city and the Portland suburbs both succumb, not just to Paulo and Derek Bell, but to people like Noel Ignatieff, who I've never heard of, and who wrote White Blind Spot, and Henry Giroux. They're a bunch of people. This is their plan. They're winning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, of course, what was happening in the streets of Portland, actually now dating back many years, particularly through the reporting of Andy No, has been widespread. Everyone knows about the Antifa riots, the kind of firebombing of the federal courthouse in Portland, They take over the streets, they wear all black, they intimidate any kind of journalists or opposition figures that happen to get in their way. That was a story that had been really told and exposed over the last couple of years. But there's a hidden story in Portland, and then also even in the suburbs of surrounding Portland, that those ideas that you see activated in the street are actually embedded in the K through 12 curriculum. And so the chapter on Portland in the book is called The Child Soldiers of Portland, because activist teachers whom I have exposed through original source reporting, whistleblower testimony, parents who've now gone on the record and told me what's happening, sifting through the documents from the curricula. They're taking revolutionary principles, they're embedding it into the K through 12 school system, and they're teaching kids starting at a very young age how to be left-wing revolutionaries. And then the teachers are doing things. One of the anecdotes in Portland schools that I thought was so horrifying is that the DEI leaders, the people who are supposed to be championing diversity and inclusion, we're actually conducting not only white privilege seminars or kind of white fragility seminars, but actually one of these teachers who was a DEI leader would subject her colleagues, her white colleagues, predominantly white female colleagues, to 90-second hate sessions. And so they would allow these teachers, these kind of so-called BIPOC or racial minority teachers, to just scream and yell at white teachers about how they were oppressive, about how they were evil, about how they were doing everything wrong. And they would have 90 seconds to kind of vent their frustrations and scream epithets at these teachers solely because of their racial categories. And so that is the culture in Portland area public schools. And so it's really no surprise that many of these kids end up in the streets, throwing bricks and throwing incendiary devices at police officers just a few years later.
There is an ancestry to this ideology. And in the public school realm, it begins in the city of San Diego. Not surprisingly, Herbert Marcuse is a professor at the University of San Diego. Angela Davis studied with him there. And Christopher, you can take us back. We're going backwards now from Portland to the genesis of the corruption of the ideals of public education in America. It's all California-based. It starts in San Diego. It moves into the core curriculum of California. You chart it. Then it moves up the coast. Now it's everywhere. I think it's basically a plague, and far worse than COVID. And it's gone everywhere. And I don't know how we're going to remedy it. We'll talk about remedies in a minute. But let's detail how it moved. And it started, I believe, in the city of San Diego.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a California phenomenon. And the irony here that still strikes me, and I was born and raised in California. I know California very well. But the irony is that you had, of course, Ronald Reagan. You had Richard Nixon. The kind of seminal figures of post-World War II conservatism were both, from California. And yet at the same time that they were winning electoral majorities, the radicals were establishing institutional dominance. And they knew very early on that they had to take over the K through 12 schools, that they had to take over the formation of the curriculum, and that they had to really change how kids think in order to change the future trajectory of the state and then the country. And they're remarkably successful in doing so. All of these trends that I've highlighted, the trends on, whether it's the Black Panther Party in the early section, whether it is, critical race theory 50 years later, whether it's, Paulo Freire's radical pedagogy, all of these ideas, almost all of them you can see in the lineage, in the documentation, first take root in California, first take root in Portland, Oregon, first take root in Seattle, Washington. And so there's something about the left coast where I still live today, where all of these ideas first take root here, and then they conquer the territory back east. And I'm afraid that conservatives, and look, the conservative movement is really a kind of East Coast phenomenon as far as the kind of elite conservative institutional movement. I look at my friends and colleagues on the East Coast and I say, you guys have no idea what's coming. I think being based on the West Coast has given me kind of a 10-year head start, observing what's happening now in these cities and states. I kind of have a window into the future, what some of my East Coast colleagues will see, years down the line.
You know, Christopher, I lived in California from 89 after the Reagan administration through to 2016 when I moved back to the Beltway. And my kids went to public schools and they had great education. It's before the core curriculum was adopted. As you say, the ethnic studies model curriculum was not yet in place. And so now it's everywhere. They weren't in City of San Diego schools. They were further to the north. And in a school district populated by a heavily Asian American immigrant community insisting on STEM. I mean, STEM was it. So it was sort of
Yeah.
the most well defensed against the idiocy, the moral and intellectual idiocy of Paulo Freire. But, 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 it's crumbling. And I want to pause to make sure we also talk about the takeover of the federal bureaucracy. My last job in the Reagan administration was as the acting director of the United States Office of Personnel Management. I got confirmed at a very young age because everyone else had left. OPM was not radical in 1980. It wasn't competent. God knows it wasn't competent. We couldn't fire anyone. We couldn't get security clearances done. But it was not ideological. You describe a federal bureaucracy today that is manifestly ideological. And I've never believed in a deep state. But now you've got me thinking on America's cultural evolution that I'm simply blind to what's going on in the DEI bureaucracies of the federal government. How deep is the problem?
Oh, I mean, it's extremely deep, and it reaches really the highest levels of the management of these departments. And you have to understand, first and foremost, and this is kind of common knowledge among conservatives, that these federal departments, if you look at education, environment, justice, labor, et cetera, are uniformly left wing. You can measure it in rough terms by political donations. It's like 95% to 5% Democrats to Republicans. I think that's an indicator of the kind of culture. But then what happens is that the kind of DEI departments, DEI trainers, DEI leaders have used those structures to impose a very extreme left-wing ideology on these departments. I did a lot of reporting during the Trump administration on this. And I talked to a lot of sources within these departments that said, they're in a sense committing a kind of soft purge against any remaining conservatives within these departments, making life so miserable that they retire, resign, or they're discouraged from entering the civil service in the first place. And so, when I hear about deep state, the problem with the term deep state is that it suggests an organized conspiracy. That there is
Correct.
a cabal of people throughout the government that are conspiring to do X, Y, and Z. I don't believe that. I don't see a kind of hard evidence that would persuade me that that's true. What this is actually a decentralized cultural system, a system of incentives, a system of ideological priorities that is not enforced by a conspiracy, but it's enforced by becoming the social norms within these institutions. And so when you have institutions where the norms are uniformly left-wing, where the bureaucracy incentivizes that way of thinking, where the DEI system rewards employees for promoting those kind of ideas and discourages employees who might oppose them, you don't actually need a deep state because you have what Gramsci called cultural hegemony, that even people's way of thinking is already determined by those patterns. And so I'm not a kind of deep state conspiracist, but I think that you can say without any doubt that there's a system of ideas and incentives that have become entrenched by the mechanism of norms and the reproduction of norms that puts conservatives at just a tremendous disadvantage. And I think there's an argument to be made that it actually threatens the constitutional structure of our system, because if you have a bureaucracy that refuses to do what a conservative president instructs it to do, you have a constitutional problem that I don't think has been successfully resolved.
One former Trump cabinet secretary told me off the record that they learned the hard way that the first thing you have to do is fire as many people as you can at the highest levels or move them out. Just warehouse them, because you've got to bring in people who will follow the direction of the people's will. I also got to say, it's very evident to me, combining my experience with your book, that if you get tenure and then you graft ideology onto tenure, that's the dangerous combination. It's not a conspiracy. The public employee unions got tenure. They established the Merit Systems Protection Board. They established what teachers unions have across the country. You cannot fire anyone. It's not worth the lift. It takes too much time and energy. Then you capture the culture after you've captured the contract. And then you've got what you talk about, cultural hegemony. Now, let's bring us to the radical agenda before we go to the solution. I want people to understand this doesn't stop here. There is for example, a UCLA law professor you cite on page 261, Cheryl Harris, who has written in the Harvard Law Review that private property is the problem. Now, there is no free society in the world that is not built on property rights. It's why I pray this Supreme Court that Trump got in place before he was run out of town by the collective, not a conspiracy, but by the combination of his own bad judgment and the collective, that the assault on property rights has got to be stopped by the Supreme Court, even as they stop the use of race. At least they've got to try, because she is just very upfront about it, as the intellectuals often are. They want to end it. They want to take it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and Cheryl Harris is, of course, one of the founders of critical race theory, and then one of the things that I learned in my reporting and then in the research of the book is I said, all right, well, okay, critical race theory, it's a critique of American society. Okay, I get that. It's a critique of what they see as systemic racism. All right, this is kind of common knowledge. But then you say, well, what do these folks actually want? What are they proposing that we do? And one of the key policy proposals by Cheryl Harris, writing, of course, in the Harvard Law Review, a very public venue, is that she says, kind of whiteness is entrenched as a form of property, and in order to reduce the kind of nature or the hold of systemic whiteness, you must reduce the hold on private property. You must kind of suspend private property rights, redistribute property, and she actually says in this paper that a model to follow is South Africa and the African decolonial countries. Which of course has not worked well there. It's a different historical context, but again, you have the kind of the permanent reinvention of the old Marxist idea. If you take away private property, you're going to have a better society. I suppose in theory, I mean, yes, I suppose in theory, in the abstract, there's an argument for it. But it seems like historical experience is never a deterrent to these folks. I mean, they don't look at any of the societies where they've abolished private property, and it always ends in the most kind of blood-soaked tyranny. But economic, and this is a good point, I think, because you have a kind of an audience that straddles both camps. But there's a strain of conservative thinking on the kind of a little bit kind of Reaganite kind of right wing that says that the culture war, is kind of it's a dirty business. We shouldn't get involved. We should focus mostly on economic concerns. We should focus on tax policy, welfare reform, entitlements, et cetera. The kind of Paul Ryan wing of the conservative movement that is not interested in fighting these cultural fights. But I think that it's important for those folks on our side to understand these cultural fights are merely a mechanism or a tool set for them to take ownership over private property, for them to take the economic terms. And so I think that you have to understand the culture war in terms of the ultimate prize for these folks. They want to use these kind of culture war rhetoric and policies and institutional dominance in order to ultimately not just kind of cast aside the Constitution, but to actually cast aside capitalism, which they view as the ultimate evil. And so I think it's short-sighted for our friends on the kind of Paul Ryan style right to not get involved in these cultural fights, because ultimately, they're not going to be protected either, and those economic systems are not going to inevitably continue if these kind of cultural patterns and ideas are firmly embedded in all of our institutions.
Chris Rufo, you really do know my audience. We do bridge. We bridge the Reagan optimist and the Paul Ryan economic freedom is first, but we thought we won. We thought we beat the Soviets. We thought we won. And then over here with the cultural concern, I've always been a pro-lifer. That battle goes on, but we thought we won with Dobbs, and it turns out, they're not going away. The people abortion on demand are not going away. But I've always known that we lost the schools, and now I see some glimmers of hope out there, and I want to talk about this. Blob the movie. Did you ever see it? The old Steve McQueen classic in black and white. The blob just keeps growing until you freeze it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So how do we freeze this? We're moving now to what do we do, not what is the problem. Anyone who doesn't have enough of a glimpse of the problem is going to find out when they see Johnny or Jane or Sarah or anybody's homework. They're going to see the problem. And I've heard it in my grandchildren's conversation. The public education system is broken. And it's broken for two reasons: tenure, and it's easier to be a CRT teacher than it is to teach algebra. It just is. Do you agree with me about that? It's just easier. You can't measure the success of a CRT teacher. You can measure whether or not a kid can do an algebraic equation. And so public employee unions that don't want performance management are going to love CRT. So how do we combat this, Chris Rufo?
Yeah, well, this is actually a very bright spot, and I'm actually very optimistic about the future of American education for two reasons. One is that conservatives have to pursue two strategies simultaneously. The first is actually get involved in school board politics. We've seen this in tremendous parent movement after CRT, after COVID lockdowns, after all the gender madness that has gotten in schools. Conservative parents are now getting organized. They're mobilizing. They're winning school board elections. They're taking over responsibility over their local institutions. That recapturing is an essential part of the solution moving forward. And the second element, and here I'm even in a sense more optimistic, is that conservatives have been fighting for school choice for 60 years, more or less. But for the very first time in that 60-year fight, with Governor Doug Ducey in Arizona, who's a wonderful leader, they got universal school choice. And now I think it's now 6 or maybe even 7 states, depending on how you count them. And universal school choice is a very simple program. It says that if you as a parent are not satisfied with your public school, you can take approximately $7,500 per year per child and take it to any educational venue of your choice. Charter school, private school, religious school, homeschool, micro school, alternative school. So parents are now empowered with their money. They can take their tax dollars and they can now provide those tax dollars to alternatives. And this does two things. One, it benefits the parent directly. Obviously, you can take your kid and put them in a school that reflects your values, but it also actually shifts money out of the public school system and into the private market. And that creates the supply side, creates the demand to actually increase the supply of educational options. And the third thing that I'm really optimistic about, and I'm actually a participant in this with my own children who are, 1, 5, and 12. There is the fastest growing facet of American K-12 education right now is the classical school movement. So going back to teaching Greeks, Romans, Renaissance, American founding, logic, grammar, rhetoric, Latin, all of the kind of old, great classical liberal arts subjects. And doing it with an eye towards cultivating virtue, cultivating kind of religious tradition in many of these schools. And this is fast growing because it offers a kind of antidote to the secular corruption that you see in CRT, that you see in gender ideology. And so parents are opting into these new classical schools. And so I think conservatives are on the cusp of actually a kind of renaissance in education. Because so many parents have finally woken up to these ideologies that have captured the institutions. And so I'm very optimistic, and policymakers, parents, local school boards, there seems to be just an incredible energy behind this. And I see it every day as a policy scholar, but also as a parent.
Christopher, after I finished America's Cultural Revolution, I read Intellectuals by Paul Johnson, but I also reread American Caesar by Manchester because I had recalled he did have a chapter, and I found it, about turning movements, flanking movements, the great one, Inchon Ming, the most recent one, where you simply go around the mass forces of the opponent. Hannibal did it in the Punic Wars. Napoleon was a genius at Robert E. Lee used Stonewall Jackson that way at Chancellorsville. And we're not in physical combat, but we are in an intellectual struggle. And rather than try and take over school boards, the flanking movement is what you just described. Arizona, Iowa, Ohio, West Virginia, Florida, Arkansas. There's one more. And we need other places, and they need to work well. This is the important part. They cannot. Arizona had a cyber breach, and the new Democratic governor is exploiting it at the behest of the teacher unions to try and discredit this. What is the most important thing, do you think, in terms of quality? Because if you have a counter-revolution and it fails, they kill all the counter-revolutionaries. I mean, it's not a good thing to be on the losing side of a counter-revolution. What is the crucial thing here? I think it's talent and brains, but I'll leave it up to you to decide.
Yeah, I think talent and brains is part of it, but I actually think that there's a structural component that is really important to understand. And what school choice is doing in Arizona, it's doing in other states now, is creating a constituency and creating a patronage network and creating a group with vested interest that is aligned and reinforces that system. And so what I mean by that is that Arizona now is, I think now something like $900 million are going towards these school choice vouchers or school choice scholarships, whatever you want to call them. And so you're actually providing money to parents who then enroll their kids in private education, who enroll their kids in these religious schools, who enroll their kids in homeschool programs. And now they're bought into the system. And if the left tries to take that away, they're going to fight it furiously with everything they have. And so I know that, total free market conservatives kind of grimace when they hear creating patronage, creating interest groups. But what more important interest group is there if we're going to have a public education system, if we're going to pay taxes for education? Why are we going to give all of our money to the teachers union when we could actually give money to individual parents and families and have them choose and then create an interest group that supports schools that reflect our values? And so I think it's democratic. And of course, the inventor of this approach was Milton Friedman, not exactly a statist, kind of a free market guy himself. But I think it's actually important to say, if there is a large state budget, conservatives need to actually start thinking of, well, how can we move some of that money towards programs and people and patronage relationships that actually advance our values, that protect our voters, that help people that are aligned philosophically. And I think this is a big shift that we're seeing.
2 points: physical courage and forward-thinking politics. I know you're in the New College Board. I'm not sure it was you, but there came a moment when an old guard tried to shut down a meeting. I think it may be the most important turning point I've seen videographed. Where was it you? Were they screaming at you, or were they screaming at somebody else to shut down? It was you.
It was
and
me.
They were demanding you shut down a meeting. You did not lose your temper, and you stood on your authority and said, we are going on with the meeting. We will not be intimidated. It's very hard to do that in Chaz, but in a room full of angry teachers, it's very easy to do. It's not easy to do. I mean, you're not going to get shot by someone. Can you tell people what happened and why that was important and what that is a model of doing, which is using the authority with which you are properly vested to accomplish the mission with which you have been charged?
Yeah. So in January, I was appointed along with a number of other trustees, along with another number of other conservative intellectuals and other figures as a new board majority at the New College of Florida. New College of Florida is Florida's smallest public university. It was in a turmoil. It was in crisis. It had become a kind of far left activist ghetto within the Florida's public university system. It was the lowest performing public university. But rather than close it down, which many legislators had wanted to do, Governor DeSantis had a different strategy. He said, hey, wait a minute. I'm elected by the people. I get to appoint the board. Why don't we appoint a conservative board and then transform the institution into a classical liberal arts university, something along the lines of a Hillsdale, kind of public style Hillsdale, with a great books curriculum, et cetera. And so I went with a small team of people. After we were appointed, it was a big controversy in the media. And I went down there and I said, look, I'm going to talk to the faculty. I'm going to talk to the students. I'm going to hold a town hall on campus. Overnight, the night preceding it, someone had called in a death threat against a fellow trustee. And then, of course, by extension, against me. They mobilized 4 different police departments. They had bomb-sniffing dogs. It was kind of heavily fortified anticipation of this event. I show up on campus. People are at the doors, and the provost of the university confronts me, kind of wagging her finger in my face and says, we're shutting this event down. It's not safe for campus. You're putting everyone in danger. You can't speak here. And then I tell her very calmly, but very confidently, I said, hey, look, I'm the duly appointed board. We have a quorum. We have the board members here. We have a right to speak on this campus. We're the ultimate authority. And I know that you're the provost. I know because the president is gone, you're acting as president. But if you look at the organizational chart, I'm above you. And so I'm the boss. I'm making a decision. I'm instructing the police to open the doors and let people in for this conversation. And so it was a tense moment, but I overruled her. I overruled the president. And we went on with the conversation, which was peaceful, and it was a good exchange of ideas. But then what we did is actually very instructive. And I'll give you the kind of 30-second overview of what we've done in the subsequent 6 months. We fired the president. We pushed out the provost who had been trying to shut down the speech. We've replaced many of the administrators. We abolished the DEI department. We fired the DEI director. We've recruited the largest class of incoming students in the college's history. We've secured the largest budget in the college's history, stabilizing the finances. We've appointed a great new president, Richard Corcoran, who's been leading the college on this tremendous effort. And then another thing that's very controversial, we have facilitated the exit of about a quarter of the faculty. And so all of the most kind of radical, hostile, far-left ideologues on the faculty, through a process of persuasion and self-selection, have actually been kind of shown the door. And this is what it's going to take to actually recapture these institutions and make them reflect not the priorities of the tenured radicals and political activists, but actually reflect the values of the public who elects the legislators and actually who pays the bills at these public universities.
So the last 7 minutes I've gotten, you've been very generous with your time, Christopher Rufo. Congratulations again on America's cultural revolution. I want to talk about the campaign ahead. I am in Switzerland. Everyone is welcome here. The former president's been here. Governor DeSantis has been here, down to Doug Burgum and the guy whose name I can't remember, the mayor of Miami, Suarez, and Will Hurd. They're all welcome here. That Switzerland, people can come and talk. But what do you want them asked when they're on the debate stage? To focus the public on the battle. There are two battles. One is with communist China, and that's a foreign threat. That's abroad. And the national security conservatives are easy to rally, and they're easy to get behind defense spending. But the cultural war has stood for so much for so long that it's very fun. It ought to be called the education war. That's what I think. We won the life issue. It's over. It's up to states now. But what ought they to be asked about education in America, and how would you phrase it so that we get people talking about it in the right way? Because those are big audiences. That's when people can talk about what they will do. And parents want this. They don't want illiterate children with no skill sets who babble in jargon. They want kids who can do STEM. They need computers. They got to be able to know where they came from. They've got to understand that we're in a republic, that we have a constitution and a body of law. How do you frame that on a debate stage, Christopher Rufo?
Well, it's important because, of course, K-12 education is mostly the purview of the states and local jurisdictions. And so presidents who kind of lay out K-12 education policy be a little skeptical. But what I would do is I would come up with very specific, concrete examples to say, for example, that, K-12 students in these schools, you can draw from my reporting, are being segregated by race. They're being scapegoated for their ancestry. And they're being taught that the United States is fundamentally racist and that all, white Americans are oppressors. What are you going to do to stop it? Or you could say something like, the federal government is the largest subsidizer of universities in the United States. We're pouring, hundreds of billions of dollars into subsidies for our universities. And the departments are 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 50 to 1, 100 to 1 or more, left-wing versus conservative. You have a quarter of university professors self-identifying in the social sciences as Marxists and radicals and revolutionaries in some cases. Why are conservative taxpayers and conservative legislators subsidizing institutions that have been totally captured by our opponents? And in a sense, what are you going to do to stop that and reverse it? And so I would come up with these specific facts that illustrate the problem and then put them on the defensive, not in the frame of general culture war. They can all say CRT is bad, but actually get them into the nitty gritty of what will you do to stop it? How will you use the Justice Department? How will you reform student loans? How will you use the Department of Education to crack down? Are you going to remove, file lawsuits against these schools? And so I think the more specific you can be, pinning these guys down on the problems, you're going to see a very huge divergence between those who are serious and who've thought about these issues and those who are mere dilettantes kind of repeating the tired slogans of the past.
Okay, I want to close with the book, America's Cultural Revolution. It's selling despite the left, right? You note that legacy media, or what I call Manhattan Beltway media elites, have been captured by the same kind of mindless, they can't articulate what they believe, but they believe it and it comes through in their questions. Is legacy media paying any attention to your book? Are they treating it the way that they would treat a book by one of their, Piketty? You know, Piketty writes a book on Marxism that nobody buys, and he's everywhere on media. Chris Rufo's book is flying off the shelves. Are you getting any attention from and serious conversation with PBS, NPR, and all the other legacy media giants?
Yeah, not a ton, of course. Haven't been invited on many of those programs. Although my PR team and the publisher HarperCollins has pitched it to all those programs. But there is a bit of an opening, though. I've done some kind of left-wing podcasts. I've done some left-wing publication interviews within the political sphere. It's been covered in The Economist, which is not exactly a kind of social conservative magazine by this point. It got a great review in The Economist. You've published a very kind and nice column in the Washington Post. And actually, most surprising to me is that they let it on the New York Times bestseller list. I think that they couldn't really deny it because it's been doing so well in the marketplace. But actually, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times as a guest contributor, and they published it, which I thought was quite stunning. And so I think that there is maybe an opening. While the legacy media really tightened up in 2020, wouldn't engage in any kind of discussion or debate. I think because we've won on CRT, we're winning on gender, we're pressuring them on school choice and other policies. I think, and look, this has been my theory all along. I go to war. I mean, I really, truly, in a kind-hearted way and an optimistic way, I go to war with these folks. I do the reporting. I put pressure on them. I work with policymakers. I get policies passed. I never back down. And in my view, the way to get the legacy media engaged is not to ask their permission, but to force them to engage. And so
on that
I
point,
think we've done that
on that point, NPR is paid for, is state subsidized. Now they raise their own money and they always say it's only 3 or 5, but has NPR featured you? Have you been on Fresh Air or on the Book Show or anything like that?
No, I have not. Yeah.
Steve Inskeep has. I'm just stunned. How about PBS? Again, state subsidized.
No, zero.
All right, keep fighting. I want to honor your commitment. America's Cultural Revolution. Congratulations, Chris Rufo. Keep fighting. I look forward to meeting you in person sometime. I appreciated the time this morning.
That's great. Thanks, Hugh. Great to be with you.
Thank you.